Before we get into today's video, I just want to start out by stating for the record that Black Lives Matter, police violence in the United States requires radical policy change, and all of the ad proceeds from this video will be donated to the Minnesota Freedom Fund. I'm not sure if you've heard, but here in the United States, we've taken 2020 to a whole new shitty level. Yet another police officer has murdered yet another black man for no reason. And when people peacefully protested, cops around the country responded by running those protesters over with their cars, pulling off their COVID-19 protection masks in order to better pepper spray their faces, shoving over old men with canes, arresting black business owners for asking the police for help with looters, and throwing flash grenades into peaceful crowds. And yet, still the focus in the mainstream media outlets does appear to be on the looters, people who are using the protests as cover to break into stores and steal a bunch of shit that they don't actually need. The looters are being conflated with the protesters, and in fact, a diverse array of people are being lumped into one big bucket that includes protesters, looters, graffiti artists, people just trying to get to the store, neo-Nazis, agents provocateurs, and more. It's a big, messy clusterfuck. Every time we have any kind of social uprising that gains attention here in the US, we have a lot of armchair sociologists arguing over what is right, what is lawful, and what is effective about each action taken by any person that they feel represents the movement in question. So I thought it might be helpful to look at the actual research that's been done examining social movements, violence, and political change. Just last week, researchers at University of Toronto and Stanford published a paper on the topic titled "The Activist's Dilemma: Extreme Protest Actions Reduce Popular Support for Social Movements." This caught my eye in part because of the vague title. You may immediately think, well, of course, no one likes extremism. You're probably thinking, when you think of extreme tactics, you're thinking of looters tearing apart big box stores and mom and pop shops with equal abandon. Looters who hurt and rape and break and steal. Well, heads up, that's actually not extreme, according to this research. Subjects in this research were given stories to read of activists behaving in several different ways. Moderate protests included things like Black Lives Matter protesters chanting Black Lives Matter. The extreme version that some subjects read had the protests chanting "pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon," which the researchers categorize as a chant that could be viewed as a call for violence against police officers. That was extreme, not destroying anything, no violence, no raping or looting or killing, a mean chant about the cops. And it's worth noting that in this study, the researchers did not find that subjects were less willing to support the Black Lives Matter cause after reading the extreme version. Keep that in mind, despite the title, in that particular study, people who read about the mean chant were just as likely to support Black Lives Matter as people who read about protesters just chanting Black Lives Matter. The subjects did say that they were slightly less likely to support other movements in other tests that they ran, like one in which the subjects watched a video of protesters who were either just holding signs and chanting outside of a Trump event, or in the extreme version, they saw protesters who were gathered together blocking traffic going into a Trump rally. Blocking traffic was considered extreme, and sure enough, people were less likely to support the anti-Trump movement after seeing it. However, it is worth noting that the video they saw had a reporter specifically saying that the blocking of traffic was dangerous or could be dangerous. In the other scenarios that were part of this research, the difference was in one, an animal rights protester breaking into a factory by either sneaking past a guard, that was moderate, or drugging a guard, that was extreme. And in the last test they ran, they looked at anti-abortion protesters to kind of get the conservative protest view. And in the moderate example, the protesters were outside of a clinic holding signs and chanting. And in the extreme version, the protesters were physically preventing doctors and patients from getting into the building. You may already be able to see one of the issues I have with this research. It's the fact that extreme is a debatable adjective. Is it extreme to chant something that someone finds mean? Is it extreme to block traffic? Is it extreme to drug someone? Is it extreme to stop doctors and patients from accessing medical care? I happen to see all of those things along a spectrum, none of them being equal, with only the second two being anywhere near what I would personally call extreme. And I'm sure that the researchers understand that as well. But there's only so much that you can fit into one research paper's headline. And I'm not sure that extreme protest actions reduce popular support for social movements really describes what this research shows. Some protest actions that people identify as very immoral may make a person less likely to join a movement, and in rare circumstances, it may actually reduce a person's support for the overarching cause. That's not as eye-catching, but it is more in line with what this research says and what past studies have shown about other social upheavals that we've seen. It's hard to compare one cause to another, but scientists can look back at our history and note particular trends. And one trend that they tend to see again and again is that the general public fucking hates activism. Or at least they tell surveyors like these scientists that they hate activism like this and that it makes them less supportive of the causes, even if that activism ends up being very effective and those people eventually do come over to support the cause. We have loads and loads of data on this from the civil rights movement. Back in 1961, 57% of Americans said that sit-ins and similar protests hurt the causes of those fighting against segregation. By 1963, that number had risen to 60%. By 1964, after Martin Luther King's big "I Have a Dream" speech and all of that, 74% of Americans thought that these protests actually detracted from the civil rights movement's goals. 3/4 of Americans thought Martin Luther King was too extreme. He was one of, if not the most hated man in America, and yet the civil rights movement succeeded. And what about activism that even I, degenerate that I am, would also consider extreme? Would rioting, looting, burning things down, does that ever actually work? According to researchers at Harvard, NYU, and UC Merced, who studied the 1992 LA riots, yes, rioting worked. It brought about actual scientifically quantifiable change. The riots started after an all-white jury acquitted 4 cops who were recorded on video viciously beating the shit out of a black man. In those riots, 54 people died, the National Guard were deployed, and more than 11,000 people were arrested. In a survey conducted during the riots, 79% of Americans said that the riots were not justified. Yet today, nearly 30 years later, scientists can see that those riots helped, and I quote, build support for policy by mobilizing supporters. They found that both white and African American voters were mobilized to register to vote, that new registrants tended to affiliate as Democrats, and that voters shifted their policy support toward public schools, net of a general shift in support for education spending. This mobilization appears to have persisted. Those mobilized by the riot remained regular participators over a decade later and remained more democratic than the general population even after accounting for demographics. It's impossible to say whether any one movement would benefit or be hurt by incorporating more extreme activism, as defined by the scientists in this study, like Martin Luther King's demonstrations, of which he said, "The purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation." That's extreme by the definitions of this study. And it's also impossible to say whether any one movement could benefit or be hurt by incorporating actual violence, like the LA riots. But it is possible to look at our very recent history and note that large social change is about more than what the majority of the general population finds palatable. And it is possible to look at whether or not previous moderate protests were effective. Did NFL players kneeling convince white America that police officers should stop killing black men and or be held accountable when they do? Were those football players praised for their peaceful actions? Or did 54% of Americans say that they were being inappropriate? And maybe we can all understand the problem that arises when your peaceful, moderate activism is deemed inappropriate and is, in fact, ineffective. Where do you go from there? Kneeling is inappropriate. Disrupting society is extreme. Scientists say neither works. So what's next? What else do you have to lose? What research will convince you that your rage is hopeless and therefore not even worth expressing? It doesn't matter if you support looting a Target. What matters is if you have the necessary amount of humanity in you to understand what's happening and the desire to cure the root disease instead of just attacking the symptoms. Please listen to and support Black voices during this time and beyond. If you still have an income during this ongoing dystopia we're experiencing, consider sharing it with the people who really need it right now. I'll include links in the transcript. You can find a link to that below. Please agitate for change and support those who are agitating for change, regardless of whether or not it's the popular thing to do. Black lives matter.